Welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm here today to answer a set of questions about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed that I received from a subscriber. And I thought it would be useful that instead of writing in the comments, if I could record a response to these wonderful set of questions, more people could make use of it. So I'm going to put the questions on screen and read the questions and then try to answer them one by one. So here are the questions. Let me read them first. If we talk of the banking education system, it is clear that the focus is not really on empowering for success or developing innovation for global purposes, but rather to maintain the status quo of the colonialism systems. That part I fully agree with. Just to ensure that I have the right application mindset of this system, and also as an attempt to elicit your own practical application further, post-colonialism or post-colonial countries are often at liberty to effect changes and transformation as they deem fit and necessary due to their accumulation of political power. Why does it take so long or become almost impossible for the different governments to herald the changes necessary in order to really roll out the education that is responsive to the needs of their respective states? Next question. Can it be that the governments had not really thought and shaped the kind of liberation they needed during colonial times, and that they simply envied their oppressors? Or can it be that the colonial system is so embedded worldwide to an extent that it is insurmountable, and therefore even post-colonialism, maintaining some significant part of the colonialist structures and systems, is inevitable? So these are all really great questions, and I'm glad that they were posed within the context of my series on Paulo Freire. So let's just first talk about Freire's own project. The way I read it, Freire's project as he writes the book and practices that pedagogy is not necessarily a governmental project. It's a popular project. It's a project in which the organic intellectuals, the teachers, the workers, and the peasants come together and learn a new mode of existence so that they can change the system. And after they've changed the systems, of course, then this educational system ideally would become part of the didactic model of the new emergent government or state. So there are limitations to using Freire in formal education. Obviously, we are responsible to the system within which we work, if you're a high school teacher, if you're a college professor even. But there are ways of making our education more egalitarian and more responsive to the student needs. And the way I do it is in different ways. One of the ways I do it is by asking students to ask open questions, right? Or to suggest what is the best way that they can learn something. I also sometimes ask them to vote in a class so that they can choose how to do an assignment. So even though the nature of a college class or a high school class is hierarchical, there are ways to undermine that hierarchy and in the process teach the students that they have a say in their own education. Now, coming to the post-colonial nation states, why can't they transform their educational systems? Okay, so there are several reasons for it. I mean, one reason is that most of these nation states, even if they come out of revolutionary politics, right, didn't really create a revolutionary identity which is praxis-driven and reflection-driven. But in most of the cases, post-colonial nation states kind of inherit their educational systems, which were created by the colonizers, right? And which were meant to create people who are not reflective, not critical, but are good at following orders. So that inherent structure that they inherit is the one that is perpetuated in the post-colonial nation state as well. Another big problem in post-colonial nation states is the question of financing the education. Most Post-colonial nation states are caught in the web of IMF loans. They have to pay their debt. And in most cases, education being a long-term investment is not something that IMF encourages. So there are financial restraints in developing a national viable educational system that is egalitarian and that teaches students to be active, reflective citizens, right? And then, of course, is the question of class system within the post-colonial nation state. I mean, private education has emerged as this huge industry. The children of the elite can go to private schools, and that is usually at the cost of the public school system, which is not highly developed. And despite the resource constraints, or because of the resource constraints, the public education sector is not really highly developed. And when it is existent, the teachers, of course, are not necessarily trained in the kind of pedagogy that Freire would support and argue for. So these are some of the reasons because of which post-colonial nation states have neither tried to or can successfully implement a student-centric or a student-centered mode of education as informed by Paulo Freire. And technically, I mean, I don't think so. There are many educationists in the post-colonies who are either deeply invested in Freire's mode of education or are aware of it. So that is a surface cause that you can attribute to it. Now, going to the next question, can it be that governments had not really thought and shaped the kind of liberation they needed during colonial times? I think that's a really important point to keep in mind, that most liberation struggles are either reactionary, right, and want to oust the colonizers, but they weren't necessarily egalitarian freedom struggles that have a long-term plan and an educational plan and a plan to create new citizenry. So the revolutionary movements were not necessarily organized on that egalitarian scale or level. That's why Pedagogy of the Oppressed as a book is a revolutionary book, because it is not saying we now have a nation, let's change the educational system. What it is insisting is that during the process of change, the revolution, the upheaval, we can't wait until we succeed. We have to implement this mode of learning in the process of changing the system. So, yes, I mean, not many post-colonial nation states, I would say, had that kind of an egalitarian educational policy while they were fighting for their independence. So coming to the next question, it is, can it be that the colonial system is so embedded worldwide to an extent that it is insurmountable, and therefore even post-colonialism maintaining some significant parts of the colonial structures and system is inevitable? And I absolutely agree with this. Look, the post-colonial nation states might have become independent, but I don't think so. They are financially or politically autonomous. They work within a global system of dominance. Within that, even if they are investing in education, chances are they are investing in the kind of education that produces docile human bodies that can be used in the project of neoliberal capital. So there is not enough room to create human subjectivities through education who think the world differently, who are egalitarian, who are revolutionary. It would be against the mission of the state to do that, right? And they have global imperatives that force them to create the kind of workforce that they can literally sell to the global corporations. So all of those imperatives are there. So overall, I think we do not have the liberty of assuming that simply because colonies became independent and throughout their colonizers, the colonial influence left as well, or that they are completely autonomous even today in the global system of economics. The dominant groups who were colonizers still hold a lot of power in politics and in global economy. And most post-colonial nation states have to then struggle within that system. And emphasis is mostly to conform to the system that has already been implemented top-down. So I think all of these things kind of make it impossible, if not impossible, extremely hard for a government to invest in the kind of education that is not skill-based, that doesn't just focus on business or how to train people to work for corporations, but rather to develop students and human subjectivities who are also reflective and critical and pose questions, right? So all of these things combined then keep the post-colonial nation states in a kind of educational system that relies heavily on its colonial heritage and is deeply responsive to how the world wants them to educate their people and make them amenable to whatever kind of jobs that are coming their way or being created. And so these are some of my answers, of course, tentative. So what could be the solution? I think the solution would come from the popular sector, from educationists. If more and more of academics and educationists start talking about what is being taught, how it ought to be taught, if they are doing research on it, if they actually go and read Freire and try to figure out, can we bend him and mold his work to the current situation, and is defining what is the mission of education in a post-colony. Is it just to produce good workers, or is it also to produce critical thinking human subjects, citizens who care for themselves but also for their neighbors and others, have some compassion and believe in justice and equality? So it would take all that on a social level, from micro to macro scale, to actually develop a national space or a transnational space in which education is meant to create a compassionate, equal, right, and a more just world without structural hierarchies in place that police the borders of where you are in a culture. So these are some of my thoughts. I hope I answered your questions, and I hope this is also useful to all of you who have been following this series and who are reading Paulo Freire with me and have been doing so for almost a year now. Thank you so much, and I'll be back with more about Paulo Freire and about pedagogy of the oppressed. As always, please feel free to post your questions in the comments, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. I'm grateful for your support, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love.